We're good? We're good. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Hugo. I'm a designer advocate at Figma. I've been at Figma for nearly 4 years. And today we're going to be talking a bit about designing through uncertainty. So before arriving in Portugal, I was in Boots, which is a pharmacy brand that's been part of the UK high street since 1849. And a small detail on a vitamin bottle stopped me. Not a feature, a feeling. The typography, a bright colour, the finish and packaging, tiny choices that didn't change the dosage or the chemistry, but changed my perception. They said, someone considered this. Sometimes craft is functional. Grips, closures, legibility. Sometimes it's semiotic, how a surface teaches you to trust it. This was the second kind. That's craft as brand signal, not ornament for ornament's sake. It encodes care, reduces doubt, and builds trust through a consistent, recognizable voice. That's why century-old brands obsess over small things. They teach us what to expect before we even try the thing. Comparing what Boots' standard vitamin bottle packaging looks like to their new brand, Habby, echoes to some extent AI's current ability to create 1,000 competent surfaces. Starting is easy, but meaning still has to be designed. Those considered decisions, the ones that signal intent and make a promise, are the difference between output and outcome. AI lowers the barrier to start, craft sets the bar for what's worth shipping. So today we'll explore how craft and innovation shape each other, how we can reframe risk and failure, and how new tools, including AI, can help us grow our skills and not replace them. The topic of craft is a subject that we've seen increase in frequency in the past year. You may have seen or heard of this series from Linear called Conversations on Quality, looking to break down how different designers, product managers, and others articulated the value of quality. Or perhaps this article shared by the SVP of Design at Slack, discussing why craft matters. Or even, in the last few days, Tommy Jocko announcing a new series on taste. It's not something Figma has been immune from either. This year at Config, our annual conference in San Francisco, we had at least 4 talks that used either the word quality or craft in the title. I mean, it's even one of Figma's company values. However, many of these companies, Dropbox, Linear, GitHub, Coda, and Figma, who often speak to the value of craft and quality, have a few things in common. They are either startups based in Silicon Valley, or they are closely aligned with a mentality which focuses on innovation. Whilst it's easy to admire these companies from afar, their approach can often feel unobtainable or distant, especially if you're working in a larger organization or somewhere with greater constraints. Such reflection on craft is nothing new, though. In the past few years in the industry, I've observed community conversations move between topics on design systems to AI, to designer and developer relations, and now to craft and back to AI again. Given that our industry is currently going through a rapid rate of flux, it's natural to take a beat, consider our identity as designers, our roles and values in the face of it. Kari Saarinen, CEO of Linear, who has been one of Craft's biggest exponents, asked during his Config talk this year, why is quality so rare? His answer? Because it's a choice. Quality happens when you care enough to keep going and when your team believes it's worth it. But I sometimes find myself being a bit cynical of a statement like that. Obsessing over craft might feel like a luxury, something for startups with nothing to lose. But here's the thing. Craft isn't only about polishing the final thing. It's about shaping the right thing. And to do that, we have to be willing to try ideas that might not work. Which brings us to the real hidden cost of many organizations, the lack of time for failure. Not because failure is bad, but because failure is how we explore. If we want meaningful innovation, craft isn't a luxury, it's the scaffolding we build around creative risk. So I now want to ask the question as to why we may struggle to get started as designers and why time is less of a limiting factor than it has been before. When we talk about failure, we're really talking about exploration. Craft doesn't come from perfection, it comes from working through what doesn't quite land. Even with constraints, we can design space to test ideas and adjust. Small failures done early and intentionally lead to more thoughtful outcomes. But taking risks, especially in design, can feel uncomfortable. That's worth exploring. So why do we hesitate? As designers, we're often expected to anticipate problems before they happen. That's part of our value. We think ahead. We care about the consequences of what we put out into the world. But that same responsibility can make us cautious, especially when timelines are tight and expectations are high. We tend to lean into what's worked before: safe patterns, familiar flows, known outcomes. I see this across companies regardless of size, not because people lack imagination, but because we're wired to protect the thing that we're building. And because deep down, taking a creative risk often means stepping into uncertainty without a guarantee of success. Julie Zhou, the former VP of product at Facebook, spoke about designers' aversion to risk in her interview for First of Kind, which is a great series and worth a watch. She described a feeling we've all shared: the hesitation that creeps in when we don't know if what we're doing will work. The thing that's holding us back? Perfectionism. And that perfectionism extends to the pride of the work we produce. As creatives, we often have an emotional connection to the work that we do, making failure that much more difficult to contend with. Through a change in approach and technology, we can help ourselves to overcome this mindset. Gabriel Valdivia, who helps early stage companies, provided a helpful approach, which he believes can benefit organizations of any scale. His core directive: progress, not perfection, is the engine of innovation. Maybe not a huge surprise. But the insight came not from valuing quality over quantity, but understanding that quantity is often how we get to quality. He gave the example of an experiment conducted by Jerry Yulsman, a photographer and teacher who split his students into two groups for an activity. You may have heard of this one before. Group A would be graded based on the total quality of the photos that they took, whilst Group B only had to produce a single photo, and that alone would be based on quality. Group A, who were tasked with taking as many photos as possible, naturally spent more time in the practice, which yielded far greater results than the team asked to focus on quality. They spent too much time theorizing and were left with a single mediocre shot. Much like how digital photography disrupted film, the medium stayed the same, but the volume increased. There was more opportunity to explore, and new skills such as digital photo manipulation and editing have since become byproducts of this innovation. I view the use of AI much in the same way. In fact, Daniel's talk shares 3 key ways in which to conduct this approach. Lead with artifacts, sketches, mock-ups, prototypes, so teams react to something real, not just ideas. Share work before it's ready, inviting feedback and collaboration early and often rather than waiting for a big reveal. And communicate with energy and clarity, using walkthroughs and prototypes to make the work accessible and engaging, which kind of relates to what Marta was talking about earlier about how important it is to sort of come with that energy. So AI can lower the cost of risk with tools like Figma Make, generating higher fidelity prototypes from designs or even text prompts in minutes. This lowers the cost of experimentation. If a wild idea flops, you haven't lost days or weeks of effort. The speed and disposability of AI-generated artifacts makes it easier to fail forward. It can also reduce emotional investment. If AI can help you spin up and discard ideas rapidly, you're less likely to become attached to a single solution. This detachment makes it easier to take creative risks and embrace the learning that comes from failure. And finally, it can also help democratize feedback by increasing the surface area in which that feedback is applied. AI helps to visualize and share examples in real time, making it easier to invite feedback from a broader group. It's also more participatory in the early stage, with lower barriers to entry for non-designers to experiment, as I'm sure many of us have experienced with developers and product managers getting involved in that vibe coding aspect. This supports Valdivia's call to share before you're ready and builds collective ownership, reducing the fear of judgment. In short, AI can act as a creative amplifier and a safety net, making the messy, iterative process of early-stage design less intimidating and more playful. It's a way to turn the fear of the blank canvas into a playground of possibility, where the only real mistake is not trying enough things fast enough to discover what works. Much of the AI narrative fixates on efficiency, and this really annoys me. The real shift is a different way of working. We design the system around the work: brief, constraints, exemplars, and checks, so velocity produces meaning, not just more output. 0 to 1 tools don't understand your product context by default. You supply it. When we pair speed with direction and context, we lower the cost of risk, fail smaller, learn faster, and converge on outcomes that actually fit the brief. Speed is table stakes, context and direction is the craft. The same claim is often directed at design systems and their efficiency. Whilst they certainly remove much of the repetitive work through a degree of automation, more critically, they provide us with a more holistic approach to how we design, helping to handle things like edge cases more easily. So whether it's AI, design systems, or any form of workflow automation, these are just tools. Our real value lies in how we think. So let's talk about that. Innovation isn't just about creating something new. It's also about expanding what we're capable of. These moments give us the opportunity to grow our craft by adding new tools, perspectives, and approaches to our repertoire. But in truth, we're not starting from scratch. We already have a strong foundation to build from. So much of our value as designers comes not from the things that we own, but from how we shape the space around them. We're interpreters, synthesizers, and pattern recognizers, skills that are essential in fast-moving, ambiguous environments. Let's break that down a bit further and understand what do those strengths actually look like in practice. So, designing trade-offs, we don't just identify tensions, we negotiate them, balancing user needs, business goals, technical constraints, and ethical considerations. Framing ambiguity, we make sense of the fog. Partnering with research, we help teams move from what are we doing to what's the right question to ask. Telling the story, we're not just explaining the design, we're making others feel why it matters. That clarity builds alignment and belief. And finally, humanizing complexity. We translate systems into experiences that resonate. Emotion, empathy, delight, these aren't just nice to haves, they're what make products memorable. These aren't soft skills, they're strategic ones, and they become even more important as the pace of change increases. And to show you how these strengths can be pushed even further, I want to share a recent example from two designers at GitHub. Katie Langerman and Lucas Opperman steps outside traditional boundaries to solve a real pain point for their teams. What I love about this story is that it hits three essential principles we've been building towards. Having the courage to get uncomfortable and try something new, minimizing risk through small, high-impact experiments, and not waiting for permission, just showing what's possible by building a credible, convincing prototype. Let's dive in to discuss what they did. Lucas talked about how the traditional path to deliver often is the consequence of creating a lot of artificial roadblocks for yourself. And what we should be doing more of is proactive experimentation. Because there is a direct correlation between the degree of fidelity in that experimentation to the level of buy-in you can get for the idea to become a reality and a project you can potentially go on to lead yourself. So why wait for permission? Just start exploring the idea. As we heard earlier, we know that it's not always that simple. The hard and scary part is going beyond your comfort zone to becoming a novice in an area you are unfamiliar with, a bit like Jinyu's experience with writing code. In his case, this was to learn the basics of code for Lucas and familiarizing himself with React to build in support for Code Connect and GitHub's design system Primer. And critically, he reiterates the importance of starting small. He chose the simplest component in the system. And I think this example is interesting because it's about production level work and not just prototyping. And that single component had a single property. He talks about failing multiple times, but ultimately acknowledges that without venturing into the unknown, you are only limiting your chance to innovate. Design is what you make of it. We've lowered the barrier to start. Now, what does that do to quality? And I think this is the really big question right now for everything related to AI is actually what it's yielding when we are working with it. During his talk at Config this year, Joel Lewenstein, who's the head of product design at Anthropic, spoke of how the metaphors we use when designing help to set expectations. Joel framed this shift in language that we've seen in AI tooling recently. Assistant suggests and explains, Copilot shares the controls, and an agent promises you can delegate outcomes. The catch is the further the right we go, the more we assume quality. I think most people's expectations of what AI can do are here, and they're actually somewhere further down. That assumption only holds when we design the environment around the model, what it can touch, what it must remember, and what good means. Reliability depends on the environment we build. not the label we put on it. I think we've all shared some of the frustration shown above. These are the cornerstones of we house these expectations and like how they're often just not met. Whether that be autonomous functions of agents, context windows, dropping details over long tasks, pin briefs missing that means that there's no North Star, or inconsistency for the longer a task plays out for. Most drift is predictable, and I love this quote that the downside of vibe coding is that sometimes the vibes are bad. Conflicting goals, move fast versus stay on brand. This is obviously talked about in some of the previous talks, produce these kind of trade-offs. So a pinned brief helps to resolve this tie. A pinned brief is almost kind of like the system level prompt, and what you're creating is that initial structure. Thin and noisy context. If the only input is a vague prompt, the model fills gaps with generic patterns. Feed it the right tokens, components, and examples. A fuzzy definition of done. If done isn't explicit, the model stops wherever it feels tidy. Add a checklist, states, empty, error, accessibility, handoff artifacts. States rule. Long sessions forget earlier constraints, so retrunk the work and repin the brief at each chunk boundary. Tool gating and pin briefs directly reduced options 2 to 4, so fewer wrong tools, fewer hallucinated sources, fewer forgotten constraints should be the outcome. So this is quite a helpful slide, I think, in terms of understanding the system that you kind of build around using AI models, and context is becoming progressively much, much more important in this. So think about it in using the word context for context, but context here. Structure. Use a template with fixed sections. If anybody's got experience of using Markdown files, having that hierarchy, or XML, which is another format for your goal, your audience, your constraints, your non-goals, definition of done, sources which are allowed and which ones are blocked. Exemplars, 2 to 3. This one is new to me, and I haven't had a chance to experiment with it that much, but this idea of actually providing the model with a bad example, a good example, and an ideal example. Models like to imitate patterns, so show the pattern that you want, and having those references can be helpful for the context of what it is that you're trying to produce. A pinned brief. Place it in the system or the context. The first step is to restate the brief and ask clarifying questions. If it can restate, it can proceed. So if it can't restate, it can't proceed. So this is an opportunity for the model to sort of verify some of the reasoning that's happening when it's reviewing the brief at each juncture. Constraints and tool gating. Whitelist tools and sources. Add guardrails like never invent tokens. If token not found, ask. Require user confirmation for any side effectful action. This is a thing that often feels like we're dealing with a large language model like a naughty child, and we have to get it to sort of ask for permission rather than forgiveness, I think, sometimes. Self-check. Before output, the model runs a short rubric. Did I meet, this is almost like writing test scripts. Did I meet AA contrast? Did I keep the design system version 3? Did I include empty or error loading? If any fail, revise before handing off. So kind of in summary, AI helps us start. It lowers perfectionism's tax. Craft is how we finish. By engineering the work with AI's context, pin brief, tool gates, exemplars, and checks, so outcomes align with the brief. So how do we operationalize this tomorrow? 3 habits that expand your practice without the perfectionism tax. So here they are. That practice leads to quality, that risk doesn't have to be reckless, it can be strategic, and that belief doesn't start with a pitch, it starts with a prototype. If you're waiting for someone to tell you to start, this is it. Make something, show what you mean, and let your work lead the way. In amongst all this, it's heartening to learn that this quote from a book written in 1969 by a British cabinet maker still rings true. Our job is not to execute, it's to interpret, define, and imagine. Tools will change, methods will change, but our responsibility to care, to push, and to craft won't. Let's keep making things we're proud to put our names on. Thank you.